We are beginning today's discussion with a focused overview of the most important issues drawn from current affairs, designed to help you identify what truly matters from an exam perspective. The aim here is not just awareness, but clarity, understanding why certain developments are significant and how they connect with the syllabus. Today's themes span key areas like the economy, polity, social justice, industry, and the environment, reflecting the integrated nature of questions asked in competitive examinations. As we go along, keep in mind how each topic links static concepts with contemporary developments, because that ability to connect is what turns information into high-yield preparation. Building on that overview, one major economic development in focus is the proposed India-European Union Free Trade Agreement, often described as a landmark or even transformational deal. The scale itself is important to note because it brings together India and the EU's 27 member nations into a combined market of nearly 2 billion people. From India's side, the agreement involves eliminating tariffs on a very large share of imports coming from Europe, while the EU, in turn, removes tariffs on almost all Indian exports. This mutual tariff reduction is expected to deepen trade integration, improve market access for Indian producers, and enhance competitiveness. For consumers, especially in India, this could translate into lower prices for certain European goods such as wines and high-end automobiles. Strategically, this agreement also matters because it comes after long negotiations and reflects India's effort to diversify its economic partnerships and reduce overdependence on any single major economy, positioning itself more confidently in the global trade architecture. Alongside market opening, an equally important aspect of the agreement is the careful use of strategic exclusions. Both sides are consciously protecting sectors that are politically, socially, or economically sensitive. India has chosen to safeguard areas like agriculture and the dairy sector, keeping farmer interests insulated from sudden foreign competition. At the same time, the European Union is also selective, protecting products such as beef, poultry, rice, sugar, honey, and bananas. This shows that free trade agreements are not about complete openness, but about calibrated liberalization. Within this balanced approach, a clear opportunity emerges for India's MSME sector. While sensitive areas remain shielded, labor-intensive industries gain preferential access to European markets, especially through zero-duty entry. Sectors like textiles, leather, and sports goods stand to benefit significantly as improved market access can boost exports, employment, and the overall competitiveness of small and medium enterprises. Another important economic signal to understand here is the recent weakening of the rupee. The underlying chain is fairly straightforward. Heightened global uncertainty, triggered by aggressive trade rhetoric and tariff-related signals from the United States, tends to make investors cautious. When uncertainty rises, global capital often moves out of emerging markets and flows back into safer assets. This capital flight increases demand for the dollar and puts pressure on currencies like the rupee, leading to depreciation. There is a common belief that a weaker currency is automatically beneficial because it makes exports cheaper and more competitive. In reality, this advantage is often overstated. While exporters may gain initially, India's economy is heavily dependent on imports such as crude oil and key industrial components. As the rupee weakens, the cost of these imports rises, feeding into higher input costs and inflation. Over time, these rising costs can cancel out export gains, squeeze profit margins, and raise prices across the economy. This is why currency depreciation needs to be seen not as a simple boost, but as a complex trade-off with significant inflationary risks. A closely related issue appears in the discussion on solar manufacturing, where the focus is on understanding why financial incentives alone cannot solve deeper structural challenges. The solar value chain can be broadly divided into upstream and downstream segments. The upstream side is highly technology intensive and depends heavily on access to raw materials and advanced technical expertise, moving from basic inputs to complex components like wafers. This is precisely where India faces its biggest constraints, with limited raw material availability and gaps in high-end manufacturing know-how. In contrast, the downstream segment involves activities such as module assembly, installation, and grid integration, which are more labor and logistics intensive and relatively easier to scale. While policies like production-linked incentives have helped expand downstream capacity, they do not automatically strengthen upstream capabilities. The key point to grasp here is that genuine energy security and self-reliance come only when a country controls the entire supply chain. Without mastering the upstream stages, dependence on imported components continues, limiting both strategic autonomy and long-term competitiveness. The conversation on social justice brings us to the rapid expansion of the gig economy and the policy challenges it creates. Platform-based workers operate outside the traditional employer-employee framework, which means they often miss out on formal protections like social security, health insurance, and workplace safeguards. This gap has become more visible as app-based services grow across sectors such as transport and food delivery. In response, Karnataka has proposed a structured intervention that focuses on welfare rather than redefining employment status. The core idea is to generate a dedicated welfare fund through a small fee collected on each transaction or ride, with the burden placed on the platforms rather than the workers. These resources are then channeled through a welfare board that brings together aggregators, worker representatives, and the government. The broader significance lies in creating a middle path where flexibility of gig work is preserved while basic social protection is gradually institutionalized, offering a potential model for other states to address similar challenges. Turning to polity, this topic clarifies an important constitutional distinction about the right to vote. Article 326 establishes the principle of universal adult suffrage, granting voting rights to all citizens above the age of 18. However, this does not make the right to vote absolute in nature. In constitutional terms, it is treated as a qualified right, meaning it operates subject to certain legally defined conditions. These conditions allow for the temporary removal or restriction of voting rights in cases such as non-residence, unsoundness of mind, involvement in crime, or corrupt and illegal practices. The deeper constitutional nuance to remember is that most rights in India are not unconditional. The right to vote continues only as long as prescribed qualifications are fulfilled. In contrast, very few rights are truly absolute, with the prohibition of untouchability under Article 17 standing out as a clear example. Understanding this distinction is crucial for both conceptual clarity and answering analytical questions in examinations. The idea of day zero helps us understand how severe urban water stress can become if corrective action is delayed. Day zero refers to the critical point at which a city's municipal water supply is effectively shut off, and residents are forced to rely on strict rationing. This term gained global attention during the Cape Town water crisis of 2018, when the city came dangerously close to running out of usable water. What drives such a situation is not a single factor, but a combination of pressures. Climate change plays a major role by making rainfall patterns increasingly erratic, reducing the reliability of surface water sources. At the same time, excessive and unsustainable extraction of groundwater steadily depletes aquifers that are meant to act as buffers during dry periods. These stresses are compounded by weak governance, where inadequate infrastructure, poor planning, and limited regulatory enforcement fail to keep pace with growing urban demand. The warning issued by the United Nations adds urgency to this discussion, as it highlights that several major Indian cities are approaching similar tipping points. For example preparation, it is important to see Day Zero not just as an environmental issue, but as a governance and urban management challenge, linking climate change, resource sustainability, and institutional capacity into a single, high-impact theme. The focus now shifts to green mobility, specifically the PME Drive scheme, which is aimed at electrifying the critical last mile of transport. Last mile mobility is often overlooked, but it is where congestion, fuel consumption, and emissions are disproportionately high. The scheme, formerly known as the PM Electric Drive Revolution in Innovative Vehicle Enhancement, is a centrally sponsored initiative with full funding from the Union government, underlining its national priority. The policy logic becomes clear when we look at the gap analysis. Light commercial vehicles play an outsized role in India's logistics system, moving nearly half of all goods. Despite this dominance, electric adoption in this segment remains extremely low at around 2%. This mismatch highlights a huge unrealized potential, both in terms of emission reduction and efficiency gains. By specifically targeting trucks, ambulances, and light commercial vehicles, the scheme aims to address two challenges simultaneously. On one hand, it seeks to reduce logistics costs by lowering fuel and maintenance expenses. On the other, it directly contributes to cleaner urban air by cutting emissions from high-usage vehicles. From an exam perspective, this scheme is important because it links climate commitments, industrial policy, and urban sustainability, making it a strong example of how targeted public intervention can correct market gaps in the green transition. This final section brings the discussion together through the lens of mains answer writing, showing how to structure a critical analysis question effectively. The question here asks you to critically examine the impact of the India-EU Free Trade Agreement on India's manufacturing sector and MSMEs, so balance and structure become essential. A strong introduction should immediately establish scale and context, mentioning that the agreement links India with 27 European nations and creates access to a market of nearly 2 billion people helps the examiner see that you understand its magnitude. This sets up why the agreement matters beyond just trade figures. In the body, the answer should clearly weigh benefits against challenges. On the positive side, tariff-free access to European markets can significantly boost labor-intensive sectors such as textiles and leather, where MSMEs dominate. Improved market access can enhance exports, employment, and integration into global value chains. At the same time, a critical approach requires acknowledging the downsides. Indian manufacturers may face intense competition from high-quality European goods, and continued dependence on imported upstream raw materials could limit domestic value addition. The conclusion should not merely summarize but offer a strategic way forward, highlighting the need for Atmanirbhar or self-reliance policies to run alongside the FTA shows maturity in analysis. The key message is that trade openness must be complemented by domestic capacity building, technology upgrading, and supply chain strengthening to ensure long-term competitiveness. This approach demonstrates exactly the kind of balanced, policy-oriented thinking that mains answers are expected to reflect. To wrap up, this prelims drill is designed to quickly test whether key concepts have been clearly understood and retained. In polity, the question on the right to vote reinforces an important constitutional principle. Under Article 326, the right to vote is constitutional but qualified in nature, meaning it exists subject to legally prescribed conditions and restrictions rather than being absolute. In the environment section, the focus shifts to the social cost of carbon. This concept captures the long-term economic damage caused by the emission of one additional ton of carbon dioxide in a given year. It helps policymakers quantify climate damage in monetary terms and design better climate and pricing policies. Finally, in the economy segment, the idea of import-induced inflation is tested. This form of inflation occurs when a country's currency depreciates, making imports like crude oil and raw materials more expensive. Those higher costs then pass through the economy, pushing up overall prices. Taken together, these questions show the kind of conceptual clarity prelims demands. Short, precise understanding across polity, environment, and economy, rather than lengthy explanations. We end with a compact keyword cheat sheet that pulls together some of the most exam-relevant terms discussed throughout the session. These are the kinds of phrases that frequently appear in questions, answer keys, and editorial analysis, so clarity here really matters. Capital flight refers to the rapid movement of foreign capital out of an economy, usually triggered by global uncertainty or rising interest rates in developed economies like the United States. This sudden outflow can put pressure on the currency and financial markets. Upstream manufacturing points to the early stages of a production chain where raw materials are processed into intermediate inputs. In sectors like solar manufacturing, this includes steps such as converting polysilicon into wafers, which are technologically intensive and strategically important. Qualified rights are rights that exist subject to specific conditions laid down by law. The right to vote is a classic example where eligibility and continued enjoyment depend on meeting legal qualifications rather than being absolute. The idea of China plus one captures a global strategy to diversify supply chains by reducing excessive dependence on China and adding alternative manufacturing locations, especially in Asia. This has direct implications for India's industrial and trade policies. Finally, the gig economy describes a labor market dominated by short-term, task-based contracts rather than permanent employment. While it offers flexibility and new opportunities, it also raises concerns around job security and social protection. Keeping these keywords crisp in your mind helps you decode questions faster and frame sharper, more confident answers in the exam. As we conclude, the central takeaway is simple but powerful. Mastering current affairs is not about memorizing headlines, but about understanding their deeper meaning and exam relevance. When you connect news with core concepts across polity, economy, environment, and governance, preparation becomes sharper and far more effective. This is where a structured learning platform can make a real difference. With the EduRev app, you can access detailed notes, high-quality mock tests, and in-depth analysis that help transform daily news into scoring answers. The goal is to keep learning consistently, refine your understanding, and approach the exam with confidence rather than anxiety. Stay curious, keep revising, and continue building clarity every day. With the right approach and the right resources, acing the exam becomes a realistic and achievable goal.